I'll put the main cam back in place now. I'm taking some molybdenum paste on the end of a toothpick. The surfaces you need to be aware of, basically that curved surface there, that's where it engages with the retard gear train. I usually just put a wipe up through the centre, and on the two ears that contact the blade actuating ring. And I'll put this in place in the shutter. And rotate that fully clockwise to the rest position. I've got the main spring here. I'll give that a quick wipe around the inside with some molybdenum paste. I'm not particularly convinced that lubrication's needed for that, but it's in the list of things to do. Get that seated on the cam. Then I've got to lift that tab over and across and latch it behind there. Okay, see if I can do this. This is a particularly strong spring. It's like a new spring, so it means that it's got a lot of tension and it will fight me all the way. Of course, I've got to do this without lifting the spring out of engagement with the cam, like that. Yeah, it just keeps lifting out of the hole in that cam. Let's try this. That was it. I know you couldn't see it because my fat finger was in the way, but that's it. That's in place. Yeah. I'll give this a brief wipe with molybdenum paste, just that surface there. Now we'll cock the shutter and release it. The internal cocking ring would shift that across, which allows this latch to drop down in place. This piece would be cocked by the little pinion on it, and it would latch down behind there, and at that stage the shutter is fully armed, if you like. If I release the shutter here, pulling this down, it will lift this up, which will disengage this and allow the main cam to run. And bang, away it goes. Now the reason that the B lever didn't drop in and hold the shutter fully open is that that action just happened too quick for the B lever to drop in place. Once the speed train's in place, that's not the case. There's enough there to slow that action down so that the B lever would in fact drop in place. We can probably do that manually. I'll hold back this and allow that to drop in, and if my finger was on the shutter release all the time, let's do that again. My finger on the shutter release all the time, the B lever would drop in, and as I took my finger off the shutter release, it would allow the action here to complete, because the main cam pulls the one side of the main cam pulls the lever in one direction and the other side brings it back in the other direction. It's quite cleverly done. So at that stage I've got to put the retard gear train and so forth in place. Now the retard gear train, I've had these speed trains out, I've cleaned them in the ultrasonic cleaner in a small jar of naphtha suspended in the ultrasonic cleaner, and I've since had them out, dried them and lubricated them with graphite powder. Now I'll get that in position. When you're putting this in place, the speed train in place, be aware that at this end, this lever here must be pulled back so that it comes back behind this piece here to the outside of this piece here, is not sitting on the top of it. And this must be cocked before you put the speed train in place, the retard gear train in place. The 2 screws for this. This one forms the pivot point, if you like. That's okay. And this one here locks this in position. And I can be reasonably confident, because of the quite strong spring here, that we're going to have to want our speed train fairly well engaged. So I'm going to swing it just about completely inwards towards the cam for greatest engagement. Now if I release the shutter, this should run down for about 1 second. That appeared pretty good to me. Certainly good enough to start with. We can put the self-timer in place. If I pull this arm forward, what I want to do is just pull this pin forward till it drops into that slot there. Now the self-timer has to sit into a little spot on the main plate, and it's just dropped in there. Sometimes you have to wriggle it about a bit to get it to seat. Basically you're trying to seat a screw head into a hole in the main plate. Why is that screw not picking up? Let's just run this down a bit. Might be a little bit pulled across too far. That's better. Is that seated? It appears to be. Let's get the speed train to run down. Check that this is seated. It's sitting at a funny angle there. I'm not sure what's going on. Take that out and have a look at that, I think. No, that's okay now. So if we cock that, cock the shutter, pull this across like the spring would be pulling it, release the shutter, it's now sitting there. Our internal cocking ring would be acting on this part, this lever, which allows the self-timer to run down, and as that runs down it'll pull on this lever, which lifts that out of engagement with the blade actuating ring and allows the action of the shutter to complete. Like that. Right, we're getting very well advanced with this. This piece, which I sort of call the internal cocking ring. I'm just running around the inside edge of that with molybdenum paste and around the outside edge of that with molybdenum paste. Around the inside edge it's running around the lens tube. Around the outside edge of that, various things are happening. So I need to get that spring on this pin. Stretch this into position. Now the spring came off there. The springs on the earlier cameras were more closely sized to that pin. They didn't pop off as freely as that. This is a later one, and they've used a larger diameter spring. The loop's more open. It falls off easier. It's only an issue when it's not under tension at all. And the only time it's not under tension at all is when you're installing it. And get round that, I'm going to put a slight wipe of molybdenum paste on that pinion. Now the tab on this pinion drops into this gap here, and the first tooth of the pinion drops into the first hole, the first root of tooth on that curved cocking rack arrangement. This piece goes in there. This will stop the shutter, stop you being able to depress the shutter release if the shutter is not in a cocked state. So I'm just holding back the tail of that spring underneath there with my tweezers while I drop that into place, and you can see that's now sprung loaded, and you can see it's blocking the action of the shutter release in that position. When this is cocked, this is swung out of the way by this part of the ring, which will allow the shutter release to be depressed like that. This piece, this is the shutter speed settings cam plate. That's not the one that came with the shutter. This is the one that came with the shutter, and I cleaned this as best I could, and I polished it with brass soap, but I don't like those corrosion patterns. So better to replace it, since I have one available, than to just leave it there. Just looking to see if I've missed anything. No, it all looks pretty good. Taking some molybdenum paste, I run it around the centre, and I run it around the cam here. This is the cam that reacts or acts on the blade at the retard gear train, swings the little arm in and out. And I'll run it around there. This is where the B lever works, and fit this in place on the shutter like that. And while I'm testing the shutter, I'll put the retaining ring on the front to stop that from falling off, because if I don't put that on there, when I cock the shutter, the spring will be wanting to push that away. Just get this ring in place. Doesn't need to be tight. Okay, so the position of this, well, let's cock this first. I just cocked that by swinging that little internal cocking rack arrangement around, and that was at the ½ mark there. This is quarter, this is eighth. An eighth of a second would be at that point. An eighth of a second is a very handy thing because you can judge the eighth of a second fairly well. And I'd say that that wasn't 100 miles away from correct. I'm going to cock it again and try the 15th of a second position, which would be right there. And that sounds about right too. Let's just try the 1 second position, which would be there. That sounds alright. It sounds accurate enough for me to want to go and check that on my shutter timer and see if it's good. It's looking pretty good to me. Certainly the 8th and the 15th sound about right. Without testing it all, I could tell you that they are well within half a stop of where they should be, and they sort of form in the mid-range of the speeds. If they are correct, everything else will be proportional to it, either slower or faster. The only exceptions being really that the 500th speed at the top end of the range and the 1 second at the bottom of the range, there's very little you can do to adjust those. The highest speed, the 500th of a second speed, these shutters never really produced that anyway. They produced perhaps a 4/50th of a second. That would be about as good as they ever were when they were new. This one might go quite well because it's got a spring in there which looks to me like a new replacement spring. I'll come back once I've checked that speed and see what the speeds are like. If I need to adjust them, I'll show you how I adjust them. Well, I've just tested that, and those speeds are pretty good. They're probably about 1/4 of a stop slow. That's not a lot. But I'll see if I can get it better than that. So first I'll cock the shutter, remove this speed settings cam plate, take this cocking ring off and that little piece, and what I need to do is move the position of this retard gear train here outwards for slightly less engagement with the cam. I'll just slightly let off the tension on the pivot, loosen this screw and move this speed train very slightly with the tip of my screwdriver. That might be enough. I'm not looking for very much because I'm only about 1/4 of a stop slow. Making adjustments here is always a bit tricky. It's one of those situations where if you think you've moved it, you've probably moved it too far. There's always a bit of toing and froing involved in getting the speed right. If I'm lucky, the shutter will run slightly faster at the timed speeds. Let's get this engaged correctly and making sure that the tab here on the self timer is behind that little ear on that cocking thing. Alright, let's put this in place. Oh, I haven't put this piece back in place yet. I'll come back and do that once we've got the speeds right, because I may well be back in and out of this yet. Right, wish me luck. Well, I got those speeds as good as I'm going to get them, I think. They're all pretty good now, well within 1/4 of a stop. So I can close this up, just checking that everything's finally in place, blow out any dust, make sure the self timer is sitting correctly there. That'll do well, I think. I'll just put that retainer plate on there for the moment. So I'm going to start fitting the shutter back into the outer case and get the control rings on the front. Let's set the self timer. Cock the shutter, set the self timer. Self timer is running down. Shutter should fire at 1/8 of a second. That's good. That's good. That's all we need it to do. Right, I'll get the case cleaned up. We'll put the shutter back in it. I'll just clean up the shutter case here. This area inside here is where the curved rack and the plain pusher ride. I just want to make sure there's no grit or dust or anything in there causing me grief. Apart from that, the case appears quite clean, so that's good. Here's the curved pusher. Same deal with this. I just want to get the old grease off there because it maybe contains dust and grit, or the old grease may have gone sticky. Here's the curved rack. It engages with the shaft that comes through the camera body. Okay, they all look good. Now typically what I do with these parts is give them a light wipe of molybdenum paste top and bottom and front surface. This one likewise, the edges and the rear surface. Now with the molybdenum paste here, there's virtually nothing to see. I'm just leaving a dirty mark. That's more than adequate. You shouldn't be sticking gobs of that stuff on there. That's not what's wanted. Right, so to get these in the case, put the curved pusher piece in first and then slide the curved rack in there. So the curved rack falls where the window is. And you can see if I hold this in my hand that the curved pusher is up near the edge of that window there. So if I cock the shutter with my other hand, I can slide this into place. Just get that back on that block of wood. You can see what I've got. Right, so here I've got to get my flash contact over its post. Typically you can rotate this around and that'll push straight on. Now my rack's not sitting right, I can tell, because the case is distorted. I'll pull that case off, and what's happened here is that most likely the curved rack has dropped over the end of the curved pusher while I was putting that case on there. Let's try it again. Get my flash contact in there. Slide that around. The flash contact should be sitting inside that plastic piece now. My screw holes line up and the case doesn't appear like it's been pulled all out of shape. So the plain screw goes there. That screw serves to locate the shutter in the camera body. We've got two countersunk head screws. The smaller diameter one goes over here. And the larger diameter one goes there. Why is that not lining up with the hole? Something odd going on there. That case is not quite positioned right. If you mix those two screws up, one will be very hard to install and the other one will strip out immediately. So smaller diameter screw in this position, larger diameter one there. Flash contact looks good. Make sure that wire's seated in there. Looks right. And there's a tiny screw comes in from the side here, and that's job is to clamp that plastic piece which contains the flash contact. So the flash contact itself, the wire is insulated from here by that plastic piece. Okay, so that's all in. We can cock the shutter by hooking the tweezers in here on that arm that sticks out from the internal cocking rack. That piece is pushed by our rack here. Okay, so that part's good, and we just need our front control rings on here now. Gather these together. I've got these all cleaned and ready to go. I've even found the little screw. Okay, so what have we got to achieve here? Once we've got this piece, this couples to the aperture settings. I want to put a little wipe of molybdenum paste on this. Where I'm using molybdenum paste here, you could use a grease as long as you're very sparing with it. So I'll just run some on that lower surface, some round the inside, round the outside. That's so that when it sits into this recess, those surfaces that will move against each other can move. The top surface doesn't need to be lubricated because that's not moving against anything. And I'll get this in place. We've got to line up 3 points. Here, here, and the tab has to line up in the fork on this piece here. We'll get that little tab in there. Rotate this until it drops into place. Now my aperture settings and my shutter speed settings are all moving together. This piece, this is the thing that telegraphs the numbers to the top of the shutter for our aperture settings. Little notch on the bottom lines up with that tiny tab on that moving ring. We'll get that in place. The front plate, these little indentations here, they give us our click stops for our shutter speed settings. So I just gave that a wipe of molybdenum paste. You can use grease. Just be sparing with it, that's all. And this only fits on in one position. If I can get the thing to seat. And it isn't seating. I've round where I need to be. I need to be round. Get this ring back on here, that's moved. Oh, I know why it wouldn't seat. It's because some fool hadn't taken the retaining ring off. Egypt. That's better. The retaining ring only goes on one way. It should be flat on the top surface. Just rolling that round with my fingers. And I'll push it with a toothpick. And check the action. We want you to have click stops. They shouldn't be over stiff. I think I can come around a bit more than that. Yeah, that feels about right. So now I'm just going to back up until I see one of the screw holes visible through these little notches. And I can see one right there. So taking the tiny screw, and see if I can get that screw to run in. Lift that up. You can hear that click stop, that works nicely, but it's not over stiff. The action works nicely. Okay, well, that's all good. Blow the dust off everything. Forever having to blow the dust off stuff. We've got to fit the lens groups back in place, front and rear. This is quite dusty, and that could certainly benefit from a clean. So I'm going to clean that with some glass cleaner, front surface and rear surface. Likewise the rear group. That's quite dusty and would benefit from a clean as well, inside and out. So just glass cleaner for those two.